show your support for the Untold Radio Network family of shows and join in on the conversation by using super stickers and super chats on YouTube. Got a question you want answered? Ask it live via a super chat and get real-time responses from our show's knowledgeable hosts and guests. Help keep the Untold Radio Network shows running strong. We need your support. Send your super chats and stickers now.
Well, greetings, everybody. Welcome to Mysterious Library. Tonight we have a fantastic show for you. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're looking at both the 1972 classic book In Search of Dracula, as well as the companion documentary, which came out in 1974, starring none other than Mr. Dracula himself, Christopher Lee, that many of us raised on those type of Hammer horror movies look back on as the Dracula of choice. And also as a little side story, which I'd love you to all vote on in the comments. Either myself or Jason actually went to Transylvania and used that book apparently to go in search of Dracula. So maybe before we announce which one of us did that, you can put in the comments what you think, me or Jason. Anyway, that's what's in store on this week's Mysterious Library.
One of these days, we need to do a show or we need to review a book or documentary about cows.
We do. You know what else we need to do, or you need to do? You need to wear one show, a pith helmet, that safari type hat that you wear in the animation at the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. For those who are listening, our intro animation states that our mysterious library is haunted, but not by cows, but by all the other things, the dinosaurs and ghouls and goblins. But at some point, I think we need to do something about cows just for the heck of it at this point.
Let's do Linda Moulton Howe's Strange Harvest, the cattle mutilation book and documentary.
Feels a little too on the nose, but I'm not saying no. Maybe a thing on steak.
Maybe. Let me have a think about it.
Yeah.
We have some wonderful people in the chat we should say hello to. Horace Smith says, evening all. So does Ed Schultz. Ed Schultz co-hosted this with me a couple of weeks ago when you were unavailable. And of course, Horace Smith, we both chatted to on Talking Weird in the past. One of my bestest friends in the entire world is watching tonight all the way from New Mexico. Hello, Bridget Hales. It's wonderful to have you with us. I sure do appreciate it. And Horace Smith, there's been one audience member already take a guess of who it has been who has been to Transylvania, I guess, and tried to track down the Dracula mystery with that book. Horace says, in the poll, I'll vote for Jason, thinking that Dean was too busy tracking down the Shaver mystery. Oh, I have a Shaver mystery story. In a minute, though. I'll let you chat for a minute. Keep voting, people. I want people to guess who went, whether it was Jason or I, to go check. Horace votes for Jason. So that's all the votes are for you so far.
There you go. We'll have to see how it goes, and we'll review it midway through, I think, probably. Maybe towards the end.
Yeah, halfway through.
Yeah,
it sounds good.
That's appropriate. Obviously, we need to remind y'all we got another 14 days left on the Kickstarter for Sasquatch Legend Meets Science 2. I keep forgetting to put the link in the description below. However, if you're on Facebook, you can go Doug, Dean, mine. You can go see the link. And again, this is one of those things where this is going to bring out some of the newest science that there is in the Bigfoot world. Actual hard science, chemical tests, all kinds of things, new technologies, new techniques you've never seen before. It's going to be big. This is as important as the first one was. This is going to be infinitely more important. So
And
if you're a Bigfooter, you need to go drop a couple bucks on it and get in there. You get a great reward, right? All the rewards are amazing. Let's get this thing funded so that we can show what everyone keeps asking. Why isn't there better evidence? Looking at someone, I won't say who, just saying people keep saying, well, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? Well, fund this documentary so you can see the evidence.
And spite me. And that said, we're doing next week, we're doing Sasquatch Legend Meets Science 1. So we'll be looking at the first part next week, you and I. So if you're in any doubt whether you should finance this, and of course you should, Doug Hychek is the #1 documentarian wildlife cinematographer on the planet when it comes to this kind of stuff. You know, his technology was what first filmed the giant undersea squid. Nobody had filmed it before. Doug built the technology that filmed that undersea squid.
Oh, yeah.
Giant one. We wouldn't even know it was there if it wasn't for Doug Hychek. So if anybody's capable of doing this, it's Doug Hychek.
Oh, exactly. And on top of that, like the backpacks that the Finding Bigfoot people, wore when he developed that stuff. Like, this is a man, Doug Hychek is the guy who's going to get you the information you need. He's the one who's put 2 and 2 together in things like the Sasquatch albivernix. There's other material out there that, again, most people are still unaware of, because it's very much on the forefront. He's there on the forefront of this topic. This documentary is going to be amazing. Go drop some coin on there and get, if for nothing else, get some amazing rewards. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I think one of them is a copy of the companion book by Jeff Meldrum, who's probably one of the leading scientists on the entire planet when it comes to this stuff, right?
Yep, absolutely he is.
So
it's going to be good. Going to be big.
Absolutely, do it. I think it's probably the most worthwhile film Kickstarter I've seen in years. So yeah, people should go and put their money where their mouth is who are interested in this type of stuff. Speaking of documentaries, though, I'm going to have to blow my own horn a little bit and have a rant now. I announced on Talking Weird. I've never announced publicly. I've been hinting at it for months, but I'm making a documentary about Ray Palmer, and who you've all probably heard me talk about regular viewers of the show, and his friend Richard Shaver, and something called the Shaver Mystery. And the idea that Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver, with the Shaver Mystery and with Ray Palmer's publicization of flying saucers afterwards, because he was the editor of Amazing Stories, and then he founded Fate magazine. He paid Kenneth Arnold, the very first UFO witness, to go and do UFO investigations. He wrote the book with Kenneth Arnold about that first sighting. Nobody at the time doubted that this guy was the most important person in the field. But he's been in many ways written out of history, except people like John Keel, of course, said he was the man who invented flying saucers. So my documentary is called The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers. And I probably, so far, you've seen a very early cut. You're one of half a dozen people who have. You've seen, I've got about 12 minutes so far. I hope to have it shot all out by the end of the year. But anyway, why I'm doing it is because Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver live down the road from me. So it made sense. In a town called Amherst and Lanark next door. Anyway, I'm kicking around Amherst and Lanark on the weekend. And for those of you who don't know what the Shaver Mystery is, Richard Shaver and Ray Palmer suggested there was an ancient alien, I suppose, civilization that lived in the caverns beneath us and would kidnap people and had advanced technology and had ships like saucers and messed with the surface people with beams. And the bad people were called Dero. The good people were called Tero. Anyway.
By the way, we've talked about, if you didn't see the episode we did on the Amazing Stories, the magazine that those were in, because we've talked about this on the show.
Yeah.
When this episode is over, you need to hop over, just go down the list. You'll see them. It's worth watching because we get into this. There's a lot of history there that's regardless of where you come from or your views on UFOs and the associated phenomena, this is one of those things that's often omitted from the conversation, and you need to understand it.
I think it's called Before Flying Saucers or something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
We did. Anyway, so I'm kicking around Amherst and Lanark, the towns that they lived in. And I'm just talking to store owners and the like. I go and have a coffee at the cafe where Palmer had a coffee every morning and yada, yada, yada. I go into a store near the cafe and I start talking to the lovely owner. And I'm asking people I'm talking to, do you know who Ray Palmer was? Do you know who Richard Shaver was? Most people now have forgotten, of course. Shaver left in the 60s. Palmer died in the 70s. Anyway, this woman says, no, I have no idea. I tell her the story. I'm carrying with me Richard Toronto's wonderful book called War Over Lemuria, which covers all of this stuff. I even read a passage from it about them in the area. And she says, it's the darndest thing. I've never heard of them. But my partner, who I live on a property just outside of town, not far from Richard Shaver's property. And again, just to contextualize it, Shaver not only thought these things were under the ground, when he was in the Amherst Lanark area, he thought on his property, there was the remnants of this civilization. He started to see like images within the rocks and think he was living on a great old temple from an old civilization. Anyway, so these people lived just cooey distance from where Shaver lived. And she said, it's the darndest thing though. My partner is sure that the rocks on our property aren't natural, that they're the remnants of an ancient civilization. And I'm like, get out of town. Anyway, so that's weird enough. I come home, I'm rereading all I do is read this stuff. I'm rereading Gray Barker's They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, because he talks about the Shaver mystery in the beginning he does a really good overview of it, actually, about 5 or 6 pages. I'm rereading, I haven't read it for decades, that book. One of my favorite UFO books. And he says that Shaver moved to Amherst because he believed there was a colony of Tero living there. Tero were the good people as opposed to the good aliens or good subterranean people. Anyway, another thing this woman told me, which came back, she said, it's really weird because she didn't grow up wasn't from the area. She was a transplant. She'd only been there for 5 years. She said, people come to this area because there's some weird positive energy that just draws people here. And that's what happened to Shaver. So who knows? Anyway, the Shaver mystery is alive and well in Lanark and in Amherst, even when people don't know what it is. They're finding ancient civilizations and feeling the call from some positive, energy bringing them there. Very strange.
That is weird. That is really weird. I hope you sit down and interview her, because that's an interesting that's weird. Yeah. It kind of goes back to the whole thing we were talking about a couple episodes ago on California, right? How we pointed out the burn over area in New York, how so many religious movements actually and came out of that. And then you have, over about an 80-year period, then you move over to Southern California within this very narrow area. We have several different religious thoughts coming out of it at the same time. It's really odd how that happens.
It's super weird. No, her and her partner are going to happily interview for the film, which is great. And of course, I want to wander around their property and film what they have there as well. And I wasn't thinking about doing a documentary that looked at the reality or not of the mystery, just about the people, the personalities, and the social, significance of the Shaver mystery and Palmer and Shaver. But now that I find there's an element of the mystery still there, it's like, this is a whole other dimension of the documentary. How much fun.
Oh, that's going to be amazing.
Well, thank you. I'm looking.
Well, that's sort of the joy of doing an actual documentary instead of just sitting down and writing it out of even if you're researching a book, because actually that happened to me with my last book. You discover things you didn't expect to find, and you're like, well, crap, I gotta rework some things here, because I'm seeing things I didn't know were there to begin with, and that's the beauty of this. So
it's super exciting.
Speaking of the beauty of things you didn't necessarily know was there, In Search of Dracula. Before we get into the content itself of the book and then the film, I have to talk about how much I love the film. It's narrated by Christopher Lee, and he makes an appearance wearing his old school porn stash, which was just amazing. Aesthetically, I love this film. This is like, we don't get these kinds of documentaries anymore. I love it. This was probably my favorite scene, is when they have the vampire bat and the guinea pig in the same scene. They've got the chroma tint on it. I love it. I could not stop laughing at that. But it's, again, just aesthetically in the way it was allowed to sort of meander, right? Was beautiful. It was, I'm kind of a get to the point kind of guy. I'm not really one who likes long meandering things, but this one did a really good job of making that meandering interesting. And I like how
it breathes.
It breathes. I like that. It's allowed to breathe. And what I found really interesting is a lot of times everyone sort of gives you like this short little, okay, well, here's this thing, but let's go look for the real thing. That's not what they were exploring. They were exploring the broader topic of Dracula. So they start off with, vampire lore, right? The actual lore, where it comes from, aspects of it that's sort of lost to a lot of time in a lot of time. Then it gets to the history of Vlad the Impaler, and then it gets to Bram Stoker, and hit in the surrounding, the other books of the time. Then it gets into the films, right, and the history of the films, and then it gets into the Hammer films, which of course it's Christopher Lee who's doing it. So there you have it. And of course that's when it sort of begins to wrap up. But they go from, here's the vampire lore, to Vlad, to Bram, to the surrounding stories that influence Bram Stoker, and the way they were allowed to sort of meander through this whole story makes it way more interesting, but also gives you a little room to really be like, I haven't thought about it this way. They're not really pushing a thought. They're just saying, let's develop from the beginning how we get to where we are at that time in 1972 with the films. Like, where does all this come from? And I loved every second of it. Loved it.
And the atmosphere that it evokes. It's shot on film, so nothing's shot on film anymore. Even though you can make things look like film, there's a certain tactile immediacy, I think, to the way that films were shot back then. The colors are gorgeous. It's haunting when you see the footage of actual the peasants or the gypsies or the natives of Romania. It's kind of eerie and weird, and it really takes you there. You can't imagine a documentary doing that today. For starters, the world isn't as mysterious. Maybe if you went to somewhere in Africa or somewhere truly foreign, but you can't imagine a documentary being shot in Transylvania, Romania today, parts of it, and you'd feel like you were looking at something from, almost from Dracula's time, even though some of it's being shot contemporaneously. There's a strangeness to it. And I think that atmosphere, it's kind of spooky. I started to watch it with my daughter because I hadn't seen the thing in years. And because we watch Monster Quest, obviously, and things like that. Yeah. I'm conscious this might be a little too spooky. And I'm like, no. And she's like, no, I want to watch it. I'm like, yeah, I would have wanted to watch it when I was your age as well. And then I would have been having nightmares for a month. So no. Yeah. I'm going to be watching, Papa's going to be watching this one by himself. So yeah, it's evocative, and it's eerie, and it's spooky. Frankly,
it is. No, you're absolutely right. That's a good word for it. It is very atmospheric. It really. And again, the old school film feel, because I think one of the problems that since we've got 4K and 8K now, and everything's very clear and crisp, right? Film allowed for a little ambiguity. Like you said, it feels a little more tactile than being as crisp and clear. It gives you that atmosphere, that feeling of, not dread, but it gives it that ambiance that you don't really get when everything's 100%. You can just see everything, right?
Absolutely.
And just hearing Christopher Lee, we'll talk about this a little bit later as far as the actual topic, but hearing Christopher Lee talk about this is brilliant, but he mispronounces one word very specifically. And but here's the thing: it's not really that it's a mispronunciation. He says archetype instead of archetype instead of archetype. However, as Dean and I were discussing off air, that is probably technically how it was pronounced in the 70s. That the phrase archetype, where you really bring out the E, is sort of a newer pronunciation. So, but it is funny to hear. But just the way Christopher Lee narrates it is brilliant. It's genius, absolutely genius.
Also, there's the gravitas of a lot of the paranormal
Mm-hmm.
narration back then. So I think Christopher Lee's amazing. You're right. But also we had paranormal documentaries in that same period from Rod Serling, of all people.
Oh,
Like
yeah,
the
yeah.
original In Search Ofs were Rod Serling. And then when Rod Serling passes, you have
Mhm.
Leonard Nimoy, whose voice is just perfect as well. And
Yes.
interestingly, there's also an episode of In Search Of, which I think came out in 77, so a few years after the documentary, but it's also called In Search of Dracula. And that thing creeped me the
Mhm.
devil out when I was a kid when I saw it, and it touches some of the same themes. So I think it's anybody who's interested should watch this documentary, the feature length 74 In Search of Dracula. Also search out that In Search of Dracula from the TV episode, which was the vehicle
Yeah.
for Leonard Nimoy, because Nimoy's narration's perfect, Christopher
Yeah.
Lee's narration's perfect, Rod Serling's narration's perfect. I don't think there's anybody in the paranormal documentary space today that I've heard of who can do a narration equivalent to the gravitas that guys like that had when they were narrating.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I don't think there is. Just straight up. I think these amazing. Amazing is the only word I can use. See, Bridget's right. It's pronounced differently in Australia, England, and US. So there you go. Could be more of a, again, they could just be more of the English or the British pronunciation. So
Yeah, who knows?
Who knows?
Strange. But no,
English is weird. It's
Oh.
not actually one language. It's three languages dressed in a trench coat trying to be one.
that's something else that this documentary looks at a little bit, is
Yeah, it does.
the various, I suppose, cultural differences within that part of the world. So there were Saxons, and there were essentially gypsies. There were people who were
Mhm.
Slavic. Like there was a whole kind of
Descendants of the Huns.
yeah, it's a strange cultural mix there, which in some ways explains a lot of the original Vlad, as you were saying, story, the Vlad the Impaler story. There's all these
Yeah.
clashes of civilizations. Like he has clashes with the Saxons. He obviously has incredible ongoing clashes with the Islamic invasion. So that's one of the reasons some people suggest
Yeah.
he was a hero there, because he kind of stopped the Muslim invasions and pushed them back. So
Yes.
there are some circles that say, well, hang on, he's the image of, and this is a wonderful point that the documentary makes, the image of Vlad the Impaler
Mhm.
that has kind of come down to us and came down probably to Bram Stoker when he was writing it,
Mhm.
comes in many ways from woodcuts and pamphlets and commentaries
Right.
coming out of Germany, which were in some ways responses to the ways that he dealt with Germans and Saxon types,
Yeah.
while in his own country he was often looked on as being
Very
very
favorably.
severe, but also somebody who was a cultural hero who saved Romania, or that part of Romania, whatever it was called back
Yeah.
then. So
No, and I do like that they went into that aspect of it, because usually we just get Vlad the Impaler bad, right? And they even point, it's like, hey, it's like, yeah, he pulled some really terrible things, but so did everybody else. Like in many ways, he really wasn't playing outside the norm. And they could have gone a little bit further into. So there is a thought in academia right now that yes, absolutely, the impaling thing happened, right? That's definitely something that clearly happened. However, there's a lot of thought that perhaps a lot of the really terrible things that he's recorded to have done, like you said, comes from the Germans, and that some of that is more propaganda or even psychological warfare, that he really wasn't as brutal as everyone makes him out to be, that rather he was very, very brutal like everyone else was, but that a lot of things he did was psychological warfare, and a lot of these stories are actually psychological warfare so that his enemies wouldn't mess with them. That he essentially just said, look, if you're going to go to war with me and my people, great, but you need to understand what you're getting into. And that some of the worst stories are actually made up, and it was deliberately put out there to just scare everybody.
it's interesting, of course, that the impaling that he was famous for doing, people
Mhm.
suggest was part of the influence on Stoker to have the
Yeah.
idea of that you impaled the vampire to kill it. Now, of course, it also talks about the documentary that, sure enough, there were traditions where you would drive a stake, or you would drive a hot iron poker type piece of iron into the body of the supposed vampire to keep it in the grave. But the impaling, the documentary suggests, and I've read it elsewhere as well, might have become part of the broader tableau of imagery which affected Stoker while he was writing, so it became so important to the idea of, you know, offing Dracula with a stake.
A stake through the heart. Yeah, because to your point, in the original, in the accounts that talk about killing a vampire by driving a stake into it's the heart or belly button, but you have to do it in its tomb and or its grave, but it has to go through them and into the ground. You stake them into. It's not just putting a stake in the heart. Again, I agree. I think a lot of this does come. I think you can see the cross-contamination of thought there. But in the original book, Dracula, they kill him by cutting his head off but with a kukri knife, which is not,
that's
for those
true.
who don't know, the original version of Blade in the Marvel comics. Obviously, the movie is very, very different. But in the original stories, he actually carried a bandolier where he had several kukri knives that he would just whip out as needed. So that was sort of a little something. I was like, oh, hey, that's right. He did use a kukri knife. But that the cowboy that was there, he used his Bowie knife to plunge it into Dracula's heart. It wasn't even staked through the heart.
Right. It was a Bowie. You're right. It was a Bowie knife. And the documentary says that as well, I think, in fairness to it.
Oh, it does.
I think it narrates it properly. But and you're right about the idea traditionally that you put it into the ground beneath a vampire because it was to keep it in its coffin or in its tomb as much as it was anything else, as much as it was to kill it. It was to make sure it couldn't physically rise up because it was stapled essentially to the ground.
It's almost like grounding electricity, right? Like you keep it in its grave. It's not. It was like, yes, they are dead, but you've done it by grounding them into the earth, which is just really sort of an interesting sort of idea. But I love the fact that it was either, you know, it could be made from like an ash or from a rose bush, right? The rose bush was a thing, but again, or a hot iron poker, and just depending on where you were, like the thought of where or how to keep them in the grave, it depended on where you were as far as in what sort of religious tradition you were coming from.
I love the other traditions in there as well, which the movies don't often cover as much. Although, in fairness, when I ran a night of horror, I played I think the first vampire film actually from Romania. It was a film I think called Strigoi. And it looked at some of those traditions, and one of the traditions that film looked at, and I think maybe the X-Files did at some stage as well, but it's normally it wasn't traditionally in vampire movies, was that you leave poppy seeds.
Yes.
So there's so many of them. When the vampire rises up, it has to pick up all the poppy seeds before it can, you know, go where it wants to. So you put it all along the path, and dawn comes before it gets to you. So then it's like, dag nabbit.
Yeah.
And it has to go back to the grave again.
Okay, so we need to put a pin in. I was kind of hoping to get to that a little bit later, but only because it's going to completely derail us. But I just want to ask the question: don't you think it's odd? That's also connected to the Fae. Like you throw rice or poppy seeds, depending on where you are, or salt, and the elf or the Fae have to stop and count everything. I forget what it's called.
Interesting, yeah.
It's
the water.
It's acro something or aggro some. It's something to do with arithmetic or athro. Anyway, but it's a very specific thing that shows up in vampire lore, but it's also very present in Fae and elf lore.
The water crossing is another similarity.
Yes. Yeah.
That transcends both vampiric and fairy traditions. The idea that they can't cross running water.
Mm-hmm. Which I hadn't heard that in connection to the vampires before, so that was an interesting one.
Incidentally, the iron does as well. Fairies do not like
it does.
iron, and you staple a vampire to the ground, as we were saying before. One of the ways to do it is with an iron rod. So there are these, and it makes you wonder where these apparently divergent traditions picked up similar ideas of how you deal with these entities.
Yeah. Well, and it's like the whole, garlic thing. Like, that's not the only place where something like that shows up, where garlic is used to ward off evil spirits. You could probably, I think, reverse engineer a lot of this, where you have certain cultures, they grow, they expand, they take ideas, and through, just cultural diffusion, they take these ideas and say, well, if it worked there for these things, as a kid, my grandmother told me that, from Greece, you need garlic to take care of evil spirits. This is kind of an evil spirit. And so it just melds together through folklore over the centuries, which begs also, I think, a lot of, again, I don't want to get too far afield from the documentary because it's such a good documentary, but it does beg that question. Is it possible that, again, you go back 500 years, 600 years, 1,000 years, were they viewing these things different? Like, we have this idea of what a vampire is, right, in our head. But that's not the same idea that they had in their heads 1,000 years ago. Have we created very strong, very firm lines between this phenomena, and maybe the people living with that phenomena 1,000 years ago wouldn't have drawn that line? They wouldn't have seen the difference between necessarily a vampire and an evil spirit or a fae, or they would just say, look, it's all over there. It's like they may be different things, but they all belong on that side. Therefore, all these things apply to it.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because as Joshua Cutchin didn't invent, but he certainly points out, there is a long tradition of the fairies with the dead as well. So often dead humans are seen with fairies, or the dead are thought to have been taken to fairy land. And similarly, the whole vampire tradition is based upon your loved ones coming back from the grave. So there is that strain going through both of them at an even deeper level than the poppy seeds or the iron or the water. So somehow one suspects there is an older tradition which all of this stuff kind of comes out of. Who knows? It's fascinating, though.
Oh no, it really, really is. And this kind of does go back to I just forgot it. We talked about it. Communion, right? Communion. That was one of those things that we talked about when we were doing our review of the book, is that his wife speculated that the UFO phenomena may have she phrased it, it's always stuck in my head the way she phrased it, something to do with what we call death.
Yep.
So yeah, interesting little thing. Again, I don't want to get too far afield from the film, at least this early in the documentary.
Well, we're almost halfway through. This documentary is the type that begs you. See how healthy a film like this is, though, because it makes you start thinking about all of these other things, or it should. And again, it's something, I don't want to blow our horn, but it's something I really enjoy about doing this show with you, is that we make those connections above and beyond the single material or the single piece of media we're looking at, whether it's a film or a book or whatever. Each week we try to put it within a bolder or a broader context, I think. So
no, that is absolutely, that's absolutely true. And again, this documentary does a great job of begging those kinds of questions, because it does meander and goes through these things and shows you the differing views, as well as some of the contradictory views, and how these thoughts were used. And again, the fact that it's the Eastern Orthodox Church that's there in Transylvania, right? Around the Carpathian Mountains, which is a very, very different form, and how the vampire, myth was utilized, also as part of saying, hey, if you die and you're excommunicated, you essentially become a vampire. That was another way of essentially becoming the unwelcomed, or the unliving dead, is what it is. The unliving dead, the living dead. And again, you see that idea that these are not necessarily the vampires we know in today's pop culture, that this is part of that larger mythology, that larger, actually, I would argue, richer viewpoint of the world 1,000 years ago.
And the film makes the point that while we think of Dracula because of the connection to, I suppose, Vlad the Impaler via Bram Stoker and via the idea of it being this nobleman, so often vampires are presented as somehow upper class, or somehow part of an older nobility, but the traditional vampires usually just peasants in the village.
Yes.
And that's something which we've kind of, it was one of the interesting things about that Romanian movie I mentioned, Strigoi, which was a movie from the early 2000s, and it was the first, again, vampire movie ever made in Romania. That was its big kind of selling point. But the vampire in that was kind of, like stodgy and unattractive and, shambling around. He wasn't the type of creature that we're used to, whether it's Christopher Lee or whether it's Gary Oldman or whether it's Bela Lugosi, all these kind of variants of an upper class, lord or king or duke or baron or whatever, who
man of wealth and taste.
Count Dracula we think of, right? So somebody of the nobility anyway, who somehow then preys upon the villagers down in the village below him or whatever. Traditionally, it was the villagers themselves that were digging each other up and going, "Oh no, Papa's come back as a vampire," or, "Oh no, my son's a vampire." So it didn't have that trapping of nobility back in the traditional mythology of this thing.
Yeah, no, you're right. Which I love the fact that they address that, and the fact that there was and this woman has fascinated me for 20 years when I first learned about her. I can never remember her name, so I had to write it down.
Elizabeth Bathory.
Or Bertoli or something like that. Yeah, I can never pronounce her name.
No, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about Elizabeth Bathory, the Countess Dracula.
Yeah, Bathory. I'm sorry. I can never pronounce her name correctly.
By the way, the authors who did this book also did a second one that looked at Bathory more as well, which is also really worth reading.
Interesting. So, for those who don't know, she was this countess. She is accredited with killing 600 girls in her life. What she was doing was she believed that the blood of and it's not just the blood, like she would bathe in the blood of these young women that she would kill. She would also, I'm going to try and keep this as PG as I can, maybe PG-13 because it's a little disturbing. She would also cannibalize the pieces of them that she found attractive. And she believed that in doing this, she would retain her beauty. She could take on those attributes that she found alluring, or that she believed would keep her beautiful and keep her young, and she would bathe in their blood. It's a truly disturbing idea. But she was eventually found, again, 600 girls over her life is how many people she's credited with killing. And she was eventually captured. Her punishment was that she was put in a cell that was walled up, like nobody could see her. Like they just put food underneath the door. Like no one looked at her again. Took her 12 years to eventually die. They were feeding her, obviously, but they found out she was dead because a couple of the guards were like, "Hey, she's supposed to be the most beautiful woman who's ever lived." Like that's what they had heard because they'd never even seen her. So they opened. They're like, "Well, let's just go take a peek." They open it and she's just gone. So this is one of the stories you hear, and it just rocks your brain that a person with that kind of wealth could do, and because she has that wealth and that power, could do something that horrible and get away with it for so long.
The happy ending in that story, of course, is she does get caught, and she doesn't get probably put to death like she should have, but she gets removed. So there is the upswing of that. I've always thought, when I've always been interested in the Bathory story, is that there was justice kind of done, even though she was a member of the upper classes. Eventually people said, "You just can't be killing peasant like this. This is crazy. We're going to stop it." You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So other members of a class eventually said, "No, this is enough." Elizabeth.
And the reason this is important is she is sort of that deviation, but they thought she was a vampire or a werewolf. I love the fact that they kind of saw them as the same thing in a lot of ways.
Well, Bridget made that point a minute ago as well about those comparison.
Yeah. Nope, that's absolutely true. And it's the fact that the people around said, "Look, she's some kind of vampire, werewolf." They saw them as the same thing. We today see them as two very different things. I think it's because we have, again, that modern post-Enlightenment 20th, 21st century technical viewpoint of the world, where we like to break things up into, very delineated components. they didn't necessarily see that as being different, like being transforming into, because that's the other thing they were talking about. Well, who can become a vampire? It talks about all the ways of getting cursed, but it's also the seventh son of the seventh son was cursed. I'm like, that's a werewolf legend. Again, we see this a lot of these same ideas that you find in traditional vampire lore is also found in Fey lore, it's found in werewolf lore, and they kind of saw them as the same thing. I find very interesting.
I think what's interesting too is that a lot of this probably was, now I'm not saying all of it, I'm not saying what's real and what's not real, but a lot of it was clearly a way of dealing with a genuine phenomenon that might just have been as simple as serial killers. Because when you think about the serial killer, Elizabeth Bathory was a serial killer who had a lot of power and a lot of access to do whatever the devil she wanted to do. So she got away with it for a long time. But there are werewolf stories where we know essentially the person was just a crazed serial killer who put on some wolf fur and went around eating people. So in the context of those days, it was imagined or it was perceived more through a supernatural lens. Well, today, regardless of what supernatural reality there might or might not be, the psychological reality is always going to be put forward first. So a serial killer is going to be recognized as somebody who has some kind of psychoses, and that's what they are. They're a serial killer. Well, back then, it was like, we'll put him in the werewolf trials. This person was probably possessed by the devil, and, they were a werewolf, or they were, a vampire. So I think there's a lot of things acting on the growth of the legend of what a vampire is or is not. And a lot of that, along with werewolves, had to do with genuine serial killers who were out there doing hideous things within a period where a lot of this behavior was understood more through an esoteric or supernatural type lens.
Which the film, thank you for this. This is how you know he's a professional. Which is exactly how the film addresses that aspect of it. Because we have Bill, right there. We're introduced to this character, this person named Bill, who is being studied psychologically because he was a blood drinker. Now, he drank his own blood, but the thing that they mention, I'm going to be honest, I'm iffy on whether or not this is true, because sometimes people say things, right, particularly the emotionally and psychologically disturbed. But he claimed to have had zero knowledge of the vampire lore, of vampirism, which I find very, very hard to believe, but okay, let's take it at face value. But they were researching him because he had all of these, what we would call vampiric tendencies, even though it was his own blood, but that what they claimed caused it was he ran across a dead dog early in his childhood and the blood had gone over, and he just got mentally screwed up from this event, that's their claim anyway. And they sort of say, hey, maybe a lot of this vampire lore comes from the fact that there are people out there. To your point, it is them dealing with these psychological issues like serial killers, right? They even speculate that the vampire is a Jungian archetype or archetype for those who speak the Queen's English, and that it is that this is something much larger, and perhaps even the reason we have these ideas all around the world. The vampire is a thing in every culture around the world in some form. The details are different, obviously. It changes with the cultures, things like that. But the idea of the undead going around consuming human blood to stay alive and punish sinners in some instances, it's found China, Japan, the Aztecs, obviously in Europe and North Africa and the Middle East. It's everywhere. So maybe there is something to the idea that perhaps the vampire is some kind of Jungian archetype stuffed somewhere in our collective unconscious.
Oh, indeed. And we should say a quick thank you. I believe that's Joe Fox, but I think his YouTube handle is MyWillie S57 or 57. I think that's a Jeep. Is that a Jeep? A Willie is a Jeep?
I couldn't tell you. I'm a Texan.
No, I think isn't that a World War II Jeep was called? Let us know what it is anyway. Thank you so much for your super sticker.
Yeah, but thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
Okay, so MyWillie S7, please let us know, because that would be interesting.
I think
Yes,
so.
thank you for the super sticker. We appreciate that.
Very much so. Very much so. And speaking of, we only had 2 people come in on the poll. Speaking of comments about whether it was you or I who used the In Search of Dracula book on a trip to Transylvania as a kind of travel guidebook. If anybody else wants to jump on, I think Ed Schultz said it was me. I think Horace Smith said it was you.
Yes. Right now we're 50-50.
Yeah, so I don't know if somebody wants to break that before we
reveal the truth.
Yeah.
So I do like this question. Like, could there again, we're 45 minutes into this. We can deviate a bit. Where she says, could there have been a species of Nancy Malcolm asks if there could be a species of human vampires in past times. I don't think that that's what's happening here. I think this is something else. This is something. There's just no reason for something like that to have necessarily come up. But here's the thing: cannibals do exist, and that's sort of the point with this Bill person. Some of these others, people doing terrible things, blood drinking, cannibalism. That's a real thing that has been practiced in a lot of cultures for a long time. So.
And to Nancy's point quickly, I believe the David Icke interpretation of the kind of reptoid people, or our ruling class being a reptoid humanoid hybrid, and that they can change. According to Icke, I think in The Biggest Secret, in one of his books, he suggests that, much like Nancy did, that the vampire legend might come from these kind of noble overlords who actually feed upon us, whether it's psychically or whether it's actually physically or whatever the case.
Right. Yeah.
It somehow rings true to us because that's the reality we're living in. So.
Yeah.
And it is because Joe has a 57 Willys Jeep.
There you go. There you go. Question answered. And yeah, to my Willie S57's point, every myth has some kind of truth. I mean, so the question becomes, what's the origination of it? And so, but yeah, I mean, the simple fact of the matter is there's something here. Every culture's dealt with it in some way. And there is this constant theme of the undead coming out of their grave to consume human life force. In China, it's the qi. But in most other places, it is blood. So, I mean, there's something happening. And again, as we mentioned earlier, the overlap with a lot of the Fae and elf lore just feels a little... The fact that this is a constant theme, these ideas keep turning up over and over and over again, it begs that question. Something else is happening here. This is not just people randomly coming up with wild ideas because they didn't have something to do that day.
There might be at some deep biological level as well, the kind of the Renfield idea taken from, I think, somewhere in the Bible, right? That the blood is the life, the idea that if something, when we lose blood, we bleed out, we die away, but maybe something else can take that blood. It's like taking our life force. So if there's a parasitic, psychic, or physical entity, it's going to draw our blood. Also, experiences from bugs like mosquitoes or things like bats feeding on cattle in the field all give us this idea of parasites that feed on us. So then perhaps if we imagine some metaphysical or powerful supernatural parasite, or it's going to feed on us much the same way as some of these other things, slowly taking our life force.
Yes. So just real quick, and this is actually another great segue. The reason in the Old Testament that it's expressly stated why you couldn't drink blood, right? Like the blood of animals. Obviously, humans were obviously like, nope, no human. But why you couldn't drink the blood of animals? It says the life is in the blood. And so this is a thought. And carry that one step further. It is interesting that the vampire, particularly in more modern European lore, right, specifically, is that it's an inversion of Christ, and they do mention this. I mean, not as strongly as I'm going to point out, but they do mention that this is an inversion of the Eucharist, right? In the Eucharist or communion, depending on your tradition, which is the bread and the wine. Again, if you're Eastern Orthodox, and I think if you're Catholic, it transubstantiates into the blood and body of Christ. But So in the New Testament, Christ dies. He gives up his life for our eternal life. The vampire is the complete inversion. The vampire lives forever, consuming your blood and your body, depending on the version of the story that you're listening to or that you're getting into. So it's very much it's the inversion of this concept. So
yeah, I think all of these things play into it. All these various spiritual and psychological and biological, and our observations of serial killers, and also our observations sometimes, and this is obviously a very trite explanation, but there's often the explanation that if people did dig up a vampire, there was a misunderstanding of what happened to a body after its death, or a supposed vampire. So what might look like a swollen, ruddy, healthy face was because, blood was coming to the surface, or what looked like
bloat,
growing fingernails was actually because the flesh was receding. So there might have been a misunderstanding of observing a dead body. Things like that. I mean, again, I think so many things are going on here. There's so much to unpack to get to what the basis of the vampire legend is. And I mean, some of it might be to the level of anomalous that it's as weird as an actual physical vampire.
Again, to your point, I think there could be a lot of things happening here, right? There's a lot of things, because you're right. People didn't understand. I do have, so the idea that people didn't really understand how people decayed. Okay, I'm willing to go so far as to believe that plays a part of this, but at the same time, people have been around decaying bodies for a long time. I have my doubts about any answer that's, well, people were just stupid back then. Don't get me wrong. It's not a bad one, because there's a reason I try to avoid Walmart. People are stupid today. So I have no problem believing people were also stupid 1,000 years ago. But there are some times where it's like, okay, maybe it's possible that they were, misunderstanding this. And I think that's definitely a part of the story. But to just write the whole phenomena off with that doesn't answer. I don't think that works at all. Again, maybe a lot of the lore, again, like you said, the bloated body, where it looks like the blood is coming from the mouth when it's actually the fluids with the bloat. Yeah, I think it's all probably true as far as that aspect of it. But there is something clearly bigger, deeper, older, because people were saying, hey, that person it became a vampire because they saw spirits. Like, they would see them, and they said, we saw this person either in a spiritual form or literally walking around attacking people. So it's there was clearly something happening. What that something is, open for debate. But it wasn't just people didn't understand how the world worked.
Brid's point on contagion has, I think, something to bear on it as well. And that often when a disease would go through a family and somebody had died, people would think, well, the dead family member's what's coming back and taking our life force or making us unwell. I think there's actually historical kind of
there is
records of people working out that, okay, it was, I don't know, tuberculosis or something. There was some type of disease passing through a family, and then it was understood within the context of vampirism and the father who died first coming back and draining the life from, his descendants or his remaining family. So
you're right. I think that is definitely, again, the origin, because in vampire lore, there is this story there that when someone becomes a vampire, the first people they feed on is their family. So I'm right there with you. I think that's exactly where this is coming from. You have something like tuberculosis or some of these other contagious diseases of the time. One family member dies, then of course the contagion spread to somebody else, and of course they're taking care of them, so they get sick, and so that's probably the origin for that. I'm okay with that. But again, at the end of the day, I think we're all coming to the same point that, okay, true aspects for where this lore is coming from can be easily explained, but not all of it.
We have an
Not all of
interesting.
it.
No, that's true. I don't think all of it. We have an interesting
Mhm.
comment from either Jay Katz or Aspasia, his wife, who were the two hosts of the wonderful Down South Anomalies, also on the
Oh,
Untold
yeah.
Radio Network, that you should check out if you haven't. And they're avid film historians, and they mentioned a wonderful film. What about the Tobe Hooper film Life Force, an adaptation of Colin Wilson's book Space Vampires?
yeah.
I really love that film, actually. A lot of people don't. I really dig that movie.
I've never even seen it.
It's wonderful. A Strange Harvest indeed, cattle mutilation. So yeah, perhaps I mean
We
there's
need to
another
review
one.
it.
Yeah,
We
we
need to
should
review
do
that.
it. It's a fun movie. But yeah, maybe this does go to some strange ET thing as well. Who knows? Now we have to say who went. Does anybody else want to say who went to
Yep.
Transylvania, whether it was Jason or myself, using this book we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about? Well, we're talking about the documentary and the book before we announce who it actually was. Horace Smith says TB is thought to have played a role in New England vampire scares. Yep, that's right.
Yep. And again, it could be several different, because there's all kinds of different diseases that were going around at the time that are uncommon to us now, because we have better hygiene, we have indoor plumbing, we have medications, we have vaccines that actually work. Not that all of them do. Anyway, I know I'm keeping it vague, but yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and answer the question. So right now it's 50-50. Is it Dean? Is it me? Dr. Bertram, would you be so kind as to let our wonderful audience know who went to Transylvania to actually tell this, use that guidebook?
Well, I purposely didn't put a comment up on the screen before because it was my friend Bridget who said, I already know who went. So Bridget obviously knows me. Yes, it was me who went when I was at the grand old age of, I don't know if I was even 19 yet. I think I was 18. I don't know if I turned 19 yet. It was a year after high school. And I did my first big adult trip to Europe and then to the United States of America, some of it with a friend, some of it by myself. And because I was such a fanboy of all this weirdness, everywhere I went, I wanted to go to the things which obsessed me in popular literature and culture. So when I was in England, of course, I wanted to go and see Sherlock Holmes and 2221B Baker Street, and also the history I was fascinated with. So I wanted to go see the Black Obelisk in the British Museum, and I wanted to see the John Dee and Edward Kelly, scrying stones. And when I was in Switzerland, I wanted to go to Reichenbach Falls, where Holmes fought Moriarty, and every bar I went to that was in an Ian Fleming book, because I was such a fan of the James Bond novels I would read. I had read them all, and so I knew what he drank in every bar. So I'd ordered an Americano in this bar, I'd ordered whatever. So that my trip was essentially just a fanboy nerd trip. So of course, it required me being an idiot and going to Romania when Ceausescu was still the communist premier. It was one of the last hardcore communist strongholds left, and it was a hellhole. Like I could tell you stories about Romania which will bore the audience till the cows come home, but it was a hellhole. It's the only place I've seen secret police drag somebody through a train station while the person's screaming, where I've been walking in a rural area through the countryside, and people in full military camo have just walked out of a cornfield and looked at me and walked into the other side. It's a place where the food on the stalls was rotten because, as the people told me, everything goes east. Everything goes east. It was a hellhole. I mean, if you ever think communism's a good thing, go back in time and go to Romania in the mid to late 1980s. Anyway, that's not what I wanted to talk about. I'll mention briefly my trip into actually the Carpathian Alps, because I wanted to go to Transylvania. I wanted to go to Dracula's castle, and there are two castles. There's the more famous one, which wasn't where he actually lived. I think it's called Bran Castle or something, right? That's the famous one. The other one was, they've restored it some now, but back then it hadn't been restored. Back then, the one he actually lived on was just rubble on the top of a hillside in the middle of nowhere. There was no tourism to this place. Right. The only reason I knew about it was because In Search of Dracula, there was a photo of it. It said the village it was in, the area it was in. So I got a train, like not the standard train that people get when they go in and out of big countries. This was a train where people had their livestock with them inside the train. People had like goats and ducks, and it was like literally the type of people you see in these documentaries, proper villages. My friend and I went there. We saw the remains of Dracula's castle up on the hill. And because it was a non-tourist area, it was the middle of the night. And when we came back there, well, it was in the middle of the night. I should refrain that. It gets dark very quickly in the Carpathians.
Yeah, because of the mountains. Yeah.
And we were there, and we realized we're in the middle of nowhere. This isn't like we were just hiking with our backpacks on, and we're like, where are we even going to stay? It got dark like this. And we came across this fire on the side of the road, like literally something out of a vampire novel. And there was literal, I guess, I don't want to say, I don't think they were gypsies, because that's an actual type, peasant types with a fire, sharing some god-awful but wonderful at the same time moonshine that they shared with us. And we're like, where is bus out of here? And they're like, no bus. And they took us back to where they lived, their little shack where they lived. So we would have somewhere to stay that night. And in their sink, because we went to wash up, there was a plastic bag with a fish in it. And I'm like, oh, your pet. You have your pet. Like, and they're like, no, they're patting their bellies. Like it was their meal. They kept this fish alive in a bowl, in a plastic bag in the sink. But when we were looking for Dracula's castle, people there don't know who Dracula is. So we were trying to use the language we were saying, like, Vlad Tepes, or however you pronounce his name, and going like, oh, doing the fangs, and people go, oh yeah, and then they would point, because nobody spoke English. It wasn't like, it wasn't like a major city, and they'd point up to the mountain, always up to the mountain where we went, and then that's where we ended up stranded. I'm lucky I got out of there alive. I'm lucky that those villagers weren't vampires, or I wouldn't have got out of there alive. Serial killers.
He's got big teeth.
Yeah, that was literally what.
Vlad
Tepes.
You literally
at first you go Dracula.
Monty Python.
It was fantastic, man.
The rabbit from Monty Python and Search for the Holy Grail.
Absolutely. Was it just what it was like? And I carried that book with me. It was a travel guide for me when I was there.
That's hilarious.
So they got me there. They got me to the castle, that book.
Okay. We will have to actually review the episode at some point in the future, but your story very much reminds me of my favorite Twilight Zone episode, The Howling Man.
I'm trying to think of it. I don't know. I would have thought I would have seen it, but I can't think of it.
It's The Howling Man and The Obsolete Man are my two absolute favorite episodes of the Twilight Zone. Obviously, so many episodes are great, right? But those two. But The Howling Man is about a guy who's going through the Carpathian Mountains right after World War I. Gets caught in a storm. Becomes delirious. But he finds his way to this monastery. And there's a guy in a room that has just this staff in front of it. And he's howling because he's trapped there. It is a great episode. It is just brilliant. We'll have to talk about it. We'll have to do a review of it in the future. But yeah, The Howling Man. You're talking like, yeah, we was backpacking through the Carpathian Mountains. It's like then there was a storm and we came across this monastery.
Happy times, man. When you're 18, you're stupid when you're 18. But now you could get a bus there. I guarantee if you went to Romania now, you could get a bus and go and see that castle. It wasn't a tourist trap yet.
Oh, that is. Yes. Emmy got it right. Yeah, it's the devil. So this guy who's howling at one point, because the guy is delirious, like the primary character is delirious because he's been caught in the storm, he's exhausted. He asks him, like, well, hold on, there's just this one staff keeping you in here, because the guy who runs the monastery tells him it's the devil. This is the devil. We have him caught. And it's the staff of truth. It's keeping him in there. And the guy's like, well, why can't you just reach up and remove the staff? It's the only thing keeping you in. He's like, no, I can't. It would take too long to explain. So he removes it. And of course, he just starts laughing, and the guy falls over, and he watches him, and he keeps, obviously it's the 60s. So they didn't have a lot of money for special effects, but every time he passes through a pillar, he changes. And eventually he's, the old, John Carradine was the monk. Thank you. But he transforms into that very stereotypical presentation of Satan as old Scratch with the very small horns and the flared. Great movie. It's a great episode. It is one, again, that and The Obsolete Man are my absolute favorite episodes.
Yeah, The Obsolete Man's great. I am conscious of that one. I think Jay and Aspasia said that they have those two episodes on 16mm. They have an incredible film.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
The Moo Meson archives. I have many fond memories of the Moo Meson archives.
That is nuts. Okay. Wow. I love you now. That's Dang, that's insane. Wow, that deserves a round of applause. J-Mac seal of approval.
If you ever get to Australia, you have to go and visit Jay and Aspasia.
I'm never going to Australia. I've seen your spiders.
Well,
I'm never going there. I'm never going to Brazil. It freaking rains spiders in Brazil, and I don't have a flamethrower big enough to burn down an entire nation. That's all. Yeah, I see. They're like, oh, here it's spider rain. No, not happening. And I've seen. Yeah, that's the huntsman spiders. Are perfectly. That's the ones we keep in our bathroom. Or the thing they call them the bathroom spiders. Like that's what we keep to kill the other spiders. No. Not this white boy. I will go hunt Megalania. The things that are like, oh no, there's a giant Megalania that's down there. Yeah, I'll do it. I'll go. Nope, not spiders. Nope, not spiders. Not me.
I think Horace suggested if you had your pith helmet on, you'd be okay.
See, pith helmets work for giant Megalania, but the spiders they climb on it and they hold on. No, I have pulled a knife on a spider. I don't think you understand how bad this is. I have literally pulled a knife on a spider because I didn't realize it was there at first.
Oh my goodness. I'm used to spiders because I'm from Sydney.
No.
Yeah. We had funnel webs in our pool in Sydney, like in our swimming pool. I saw Newsweek ran an article about Sydney man discovers funnel web in pool, and I'm like, this is literally. I shared it on Facebook like a month ago. I'm like, how is this a news article? We had funnel webs in our pool, like in the summer. Every second day, you were getting the cleaning net and fishing them out. They'd take like an air bubble around them and they pretend they were dead. So if you went in the pool and you and trod on it, I assume it would bite you. I had many funnel web encounters. In my house, I'd have funnel web encounters. And they're like a tank. They're not scared like a normal spider will scurry away. This thing just goes and rears up at you ready to fight.
We have spiders that will do that here, where they're much smaller, but they rear up and they chase you. You're like, what the heck? Now, of course, this is why we wear boots. And it's like, no, I'm on the top of the food chain here.
They'll screen those episodes for you when you go to sleep, and you can sleep in their cinema. It's wonderful. Their private cinema in the Masons. I've had so many wonderful times watching movies there. I can't even tell you.
Well, if I get a chance, I will definitely take you up on that offer. I don't know how. It may depend on how well armed I am, though, against the spiders.
I think you'll be okay.
I have done very well training myself to not just be terrified of spiders, and yet every once in a while my friend would be, hey, did you see this? And I swear this is a thing. He had taken a picture. It's just a spider that had, but he got real close with his cell phone. He's like, hey, Jason, can I show you something? I'm like, yeah, sure. I'm sitting there working back when we were all in offices. He's like, yeah, so I just came out this morning, saw this really weird thing. What do you think it is? And it's just right here in my face, and it's this spider just up close on a web.
I'll tell you a quick funny story. We're probably winding down. Here's a friend-hating story. You're like, it wasn't me. I was part of the prank. I have a friend in Australia whose name will remain nameless. He wouldn't be watching anyway, but I don't want to name shame him. In my college days, I used to live in a house with my brother, and we constantly had people crushing with us on the cheap because they knew they could. Mm-hmm. So it was like a DOS house, as they call it, for like, I don't know, years. Anyway, one of my very good friends was a professional wrestler. He's wrestled for WCW here. I think he's wrestled for WWE. He ran a wrestling company in Australia. A big guy, like somebody you wouldn't want to fight. I don't know, 300 pound or at least 250, 260, 270. But he had an unholy terror of arachnids. Like he was so scared of them. And one time he was, somehow, I don't even know how he ended up there. He ended up living in what was my brother's dark room, which all it was a section of the house, which we put black plastic on and blacked out the window so you could develop film in there, right? And then later on, I tore it all down. It became my office when I was doing some of my postgraduate work. But he turned it into like this bedroom for himself when he moved in, and that was fun. I don't think my brother was developing anything. And we did this horrible joke. We said, "Oh, look at that spider. Oh, look at it." And he was like, "Whoa." And he was in the little area he was living, which was like a womb for him. We're like, "Oh, no, don't bring a spider in here." And we said, "Oh, we're going to get it. Oh, yeah, don't." When we're going like, "Don't pick it up. That's crazy." "Oh, don't, you picked it up." And then we had this little like bread, the kind of thing you tie around the top of a bread, an old bread like package, those little metal plastic combo ties.
Yeah, the ties.
And we wrapped it around a piece like a dust bunny we pulled out from under the fridge or something. And I was like, "I'm going to show it to you. I'm going to show it to you." He's like, "Don't you bring that in here. Don't you bring it in here." And I walked in, I said, "Here you go, mate." And I threw it at him. And he burst out of those lips like a baby coming into the world for the first time in those black plastic of the darkroom. And he was only wearing his underpants. He was a big round man, so he looked like a baby in a pair of diapers almost. And he just burst out of there, just screaming with expletives erupting out of his mouth.
That is hilarious.
Yeah, so there you go. That's a terrible spider prank, which I promise nobody will do to you if you go to Sydney. I don't think, Jason.
All I'm going to say is I would probably not have responded nearly that well.
Oh, it wasn't good. It was an ugly sight, but hilarious. It's burnt into my mind. It doesn't take long to evoke that memory up.
Yes, that is hilarious. It's evil, but I like it. This is why we're friends. This is why we're friends.
And when I was meaner when I was in my 20s than today. I'm not that mean now.
Ooh. Yeah, hold on. So to Horsemith's point, thank you. An acquaintance died of a spider bite there in Michigan infection. No need to go to Australia to run the trouble. No, this is absolutely true. We have spiders here in Texas. I know there are other places here, but like here, it's the brown recluse. They're all over North America. But actually, Christy, my wife, when she was in college, they had this spring sort of week-long thing that people would do. She didn't get a chance to go, but she knew someone who went. And she got a brown recluse bite while they were at one of these factories, and they didn't treat it, and the woman nearly died. I mean, brown recluse spider bites are nothing to mess with at all. I've known people who've had like chunks of their body removed because of the infection from one of those bites if it's not treated immediately. So yeah.
Like a flesh rotting thing or something, right? Like
it's a necrotic and actually kills the. It's terrible. I mean, just absolutely terrible. So that's nothing to mess around with. But yeah, so there you go. No, true. Yeah, spiders are a problem everywhere. Because they got 8 eyes and they're always up to something. I'm just saying. I mean, people. Oh, you have arachnophobia. No, I have a reasonable phobia. It's like a phobia is unreasonable. I'm very reasonable. It has 8 eyes and it's always up to something. We should be scared of spiders. Just saying.
In my bedroom in Sydney, I would regularly have, I'm not even kidding you, spiders which were like almost the size of my hand, like on the roof. Or they were called huntsmen. These big, they were. I'd have them all the time. And if you were kind, you'd catch it and you'd take it out. So if you were feeling mean, you'd use a vacuum cleaner and suck it up. Again, I was crueler when I was in my 20s.
I'm not saying I've done that. I'm just saying I absolutely have done that very thing. Just saying.
Well, what a show.
I may have shot at least one spider with a shotgun.
Oh, my goodness.
Not in my house. That would be frowned upon.
Oh, yeah, I would hope not. That would be a little bit of overkill.
I'm just saying I want to make certain it stays down.
That'll do it.
It'll do it.
Well, what a show tonight. What fun. From spiders back all the way, we traced it back to vampires and Dracula to my weird little trip through Twilight Zone episodes. That's why I love this show.
Yeah, that's why it's great. Well, that and I get to see and talk to the second most handsome man on the internet.
Well, there's you first, Jason.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, I can't talk to me. It's just weird.
Jay Katz is a handsome man who's been chiming in tonight. He's a very debonair man. My goodness. We all pale behind Jay, I think.
That's fair. Well,
and people should go. People who haven't seen it yet, go and watch Down South Anomalies. Mm-hmm. It's such a great show.
Yes, it is.
I've said it before. I shouldn't have a favorite on the network. It's probably my favorite show on the network.
I'm hurt.
It's a good show.
But
Well, I
it's true.
can't vote for my own, but I mean, it's a heck of a
Yes,
show.
you can. You absolutely can. You can
Don't know
absolutely
about
vote for
that.
your own show. Who said you can't?
Don't know about that. Go check out Down South Anomalies. It's great.
Yes, no, absolutely do. On that note, we love every single one of y'all. Like I said, this is one of the times we're planning ahead. Next week, we're going to talk about the Sasquatch Legend Meets Science Part 1, which is the prior film. Again, we have the Kickstarter going on for Legend Meets Science Numero Dos, which we do highly recommend because, again, this is going to be, you want to see an interesting conversation. Next week's going to be an interesting conversation. But imagine the conversations people are going to have when Legend Meets Science 2 comes out, and we can do things like chemical testing Sasquatch alba vernix. And again, there's some technology out there that Doug's been playing with. It's really interesting. I don't want to spoil it. So there you have it. On that note, thank you to everyone out there on the interwebs, whether you're watching live or on replay, listening on the Untold Radio app, if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook or any of the other places. We really do appreciate y'all, and we'll catch y'all next time behind the card catalog.